Welcome to my short tutorial on decision trees. Can be a little bit of a sticking point for some people, but as we're going to see, it's not that difficult. So in this video I'm going to be concentrating on what decision trees actually are and looking at some of the pros and the cons and when we can use a decision tree. In my next video I will be looking at some of the calculations that are involved in how to map out a decision tree. So if that's what you're looking for, go ahead to my next video. But anyway, in the meantime, a decision tree is a mathematical model used to help managers make decisions. Now, managers will have to make many decisions. It's all part of what management's all about. And a decision tree presents a number of options to them, and it forces them to consider the likelihood of success and what the payoffs of that are. So, for example, if we're going to start a new marketing campaign, we don't know whether that's going to be successful. Let's say this marketing campaign is for ice cream. In the summer, there may be a big rainy season. You know, there might be a lot of rain, as there is in the UK. But so that's going to mean that there's the chances of that campaign being successful are much less likely. So we have to consider the probability of rain and how that might affect the marketing campaign for ice cream. So a decision tree forces managers to consider that. And there are a number of situations that we can use a decision tree for. Effectively, you can do it any time when you make a decision. Some examples from the course are things like relocating. So perhaps a business moving their manufacturing abroad. It could be for starting a new campaign that we've mentioned. Any of those options, it's possible to use a decision tree for. As mentioned, it considers all the risks and probabilities of success and failure, and ultimately the whole point of the decision tree is to consider, bearing in mind the risk of failure, is a course of action worth the risk? Does the business think that they're going to be better off as a result of having taken that decision? So anyway, some of the positives of decision trees. It gives you a straightforward, clear result. So at the end of doing the decision tree calculations, you will have a net gain, which is essentially taking into account the probability of success and the cost of the project, how on average for every time that this, if you were to complete the decision tree 100 times, how much money on average would you be making? And yeah, it gives you a straightforward, clear result. You can compare the different branches of the decision tree, which I'll talk about a bit more in my next video when we start actually looking at one of these. It forces the managers to consider the possibility of failure and the potential risks. Now, what we mean by that is managers, if they're very keen on something, it means that they might be exaggerating the possibility of success. So we think that something's going to be very successful, and they might ignore some of the potential downfalls of this, some of the potential risks of failure. A decision tree forces them to consider these things that might not necessarily happen. So if a decision is very risky, going against market forces and things like that, it forces them to consider whether it's going to be successful and the possibility that they might feel. And it also considers the costs of the project. Involved with this, it also has, as you'll see in the next video, there is a section where there is costs. So we have to weigh up the not only the potential incomes of any project, but also the cost of setting up that project as well. And that's considered within the decision tree. However, there are some situations, or there are some problems with decision trees. For example, probabilities are estimates and could be inaccurate. In order to create a decision tree, managers will have to consider what the probabilities are. Now, those could be, well, if we take this back to our our ice cream campaign, it's the probability of rain. Now, the weather is less than reliable in the UK. So ultimately, much as we'd like to be able to get our probabilities right and things like that, they could be inaccurate, which means that our decision tree will be of less value because we will have different expected outcomes. Certain decisions may seem more profitable than others. Also, this is a very important one, it ignores the qualitative aspects. So what we mean by that is a decision tree can only really take into account numerical figures. It can't take into account, it's very difficult to measure the success of a campaign before it's actually started, or the probability of success. People's actions are not usually something that you can define into or condense into some statistical figures. Humans don't operate like that. So yeah, qualitative factors, qualitative aspects are very difficult to include into the decision tree. It's purely a quantitative method. Also, probabilities could be based on a manager's bias. Now, what we mean by that is a manager could be thinking, I really want to take this course of action. This is going to be the finest ice cream marketing campaign. We're going to put all the resources into it. It's going to be my baby, as it were. And they might take real pride in that ice cream marketing campaign. But if realistically, they will push that even if it's not considered profitable. So they may exaggerate the possibility of sun in the summer when actually they've got no data to do that. Or they might exaggerate the figures as to how successful their marketing campaign is going to be. They think they can sell 2 ice creams to everyone in the UK, for example, when really that's not realistic. So the managers could use their own bias to effectively skew the decision tree. And also, it doesn't actually reduce the risks. It forces managers to consider when the risks actually happen, but are those risks any less as a result of having done the decision tree? No. But it does mean that they can consider them. Yeah, and the other thing that you might need to consider in the exam is when a decision tree might be appropriate. Now, the key thing with the decision tree, obviously, because it's a mathematical model, the more data that there is, the more numerical values and things that we can bring into this to consider, the more effective the decision tree will be. If there's lots of qualitative data, that's going to be very difficult to consider. And it's going to be very difficult to apply the decision tree. It's going to have significantly less value. So yeah, that's decision trees. In my next video I'm going to look at some of the numerical measures. See you next time.